Hi everybody, Creative Katie Karen Burchill here. Welcome to my channel. Today, a napkin art journal from the Break the Blank page, What Comes Next. There's the napkin and the finished project. And here's another project I do using the same napkin. Different techniques, different feel. That will be in another video. So this is the beautiful napkin from NinnysNapkins.com. Love, love, love these tulips. I've had this for a while, and today, because it's snowing, I am going to make it bloom in my studio. So I'm removing the two excess plies, and I use those for either cleaning up or for providing texture on a page. And then I'm just water cutting the element or elements that I think I may use on this page. I'm using a fine line brush, and I put a little bit of water on it, and then little by little, as you see me going, I'm just pulling it off. I like that torn edge. You can use scissors. Now at this point, I was going to use this flower on this background. I do change, and that's part of the process. And here is the page. This started with vintage printables, and I just liked the look better. It was more what I wanted to do. Now there's that key right there, so I'm applying a little bit of gesso to knock that back because that's just going to interfere with my focal image. But I was hoping to see some of those vintage printables still peeking through at the end, and some do. Not as many as I'd like. So back to water cutting. Now that I've figured out the background that I'm going to have or start with, I'm cutting out some of this extra stuff. Now, I like to remove all this because it just looks neater to me, but this also makes it a little bit harder to manipulate this focal image because the flower will, potentially rip, and it's just harder to manipulate. So if you have trouble, keep those white parts in, and they will mostly go clear. I just posted a thing there saying that there will be a full recap of all the steps at the end of the video. I've tried to include those in most of my videos to let you know which techniques have been used. I don't want the straight edge here, so I'm just kind of doing a very little bit of a cut, more to just fray the edges. So now I'm going to play with composition. Do I want it here? Do I want it there? And quite honestly, I am embarrassed to tell you how long I spend flipping it back and forth, trying one thing or another. There's a lot of auditioning going on. Thinking, do I want this? Do I want to separate it? But that's the joy with the napkins because you can cut it however you want to fit your composition. And actually, I really like that, what I had. But I don't use that. Spoiler alert. So I decided to do the other orientation, and I grabbed this brick stencil. This is one of the new slimline stencils. This is brick vertical, and I'm taking my thick gesso and I'm pushing it through the stencil to get this kind of brick wall texture in the background, which I'm going to bring out later. It's very imprecise, very subtle, and I use this instead of modeling paste when I want texture, but I don't want too much texture because I know I'm going to be decoupaging other layers on, and that might interfere with it. It's really hard to see, but it's there. So now I'm taking a makeup sponge with brown and very lightly just colorizing the background. I don't want this to be a solid color, so I'm grabbing my baby wipe. I don't want it to get too dark. I have a tendency to doing that, but I do want to bring out the texture from the gesso through a stencil, as well as all those vintage printables. Because even if you can't see the print, there's that layering of paper, and that's giving wonderful texture to the page. Just trying my focal image on there, deciding that I want some script stamp on there. That always seems to go well in my mind with vintage. I'm just adding a little bit more. And part of that is because some of my vintage printables got pushed back a little bit too much. Now there I had stamped with paint and it was getting too blotchy, so now I've come back with black archival ink and I'm stamping again. Back to trying this out and finalizing some more decisions and the placement of the script. Are there any places that are lacking? So now I've got some of the brown paint on the makeup sponge and I'm rubbing it where the gesso went through the stencil. And I want to bring out that texture. I come back in doing the same thing with black, but I started with the brown because I thought maybe that would be enough because I was fearful of getting a little too dark. And here I decide I'm going to add some pink that's in the flowers to that background, just very subtly. I want the whole page to work together. That's just Liquitex Basics paint. It just was at the end of the tube and I cut it open and I put it in these containers and use it up from there. Trying it out, back and forth we go. Now I think here's where I'm getting the black paint, but this time I'm using the Ranger blending tool, the foam blending tool. I find it you might have a little bit more control than with the regular makeup sponge for bringing out the texture like this. It's easier for me to be a more light-handed and not get it so smudged up. And since I have the ink blending tool, I'm using it for the edges. The foam blending tool that you see here, they tend to last better than the dollar store makeup sponges. They don't fall apart as easily, I find. And I'm using a sentiment from my soon to be sentiment pack, Embrace the Possibilities. And a new day has a full amount of possibilities. Now I'm gluing down the napkin and I put it in its place, flip over part of it, put the matte medium underneath, flip it over, cover it, and then I put the glue on the other side. The fluid medium goes on top to seal it, and that will help with any shading that I do later. It'll take the paint a little bit better. Then I grab this other slimline stencil, and I will put a list of them in the description box, but they are not available on Amazon at the time of the taping of this because they are new for winter 2021. But they are available at the TCW Shopify store, and there's a link to that as well. This is a good basic one. I thought, gee, I want to introduce a bit of more foliage up here. So I'm choosing greens that are in the leaves down below. And I decide to cut off some of the white on my sentiment instead of leaving it as a rectangle. But again, I start with the bigger rectangle, and then as I fine tune my composition and make my final decisions, then I decide if I'm going to keep it in that rectangle or I'm going to cut off a lot of the white. This time I cut off a lot of the white because this page is very vintagey. I toyed with the idea of maybe giving it a wash of color. I chose not to on this time. Looking at it, I need a little more balance, so I'm adding a few more green leaves. And I'm putting the stencil back on. I want them a little bit darker. Have a bigger presence on the page. It's always a good idea, though, to go light at first and go up. Sorry about that. Now I'm just giving these a very light wash of acrylic paint. The acrylic paint is washed or watered down, and I'm just giving it a little bit of extra color, just to brighten it up and make it a little bit more stand out. And you can see the texture. You can see the bricks texture there that's brought out. That's a good shot of that. Adding a little more color to the green leaves. Again, I want that focal image to be front and center. Grab my thinned gold and I am splattering gold across the page. Gotta have some bling. Now I'm ready to glue down the sentiment. And I put it in its place and then I remove one at a time so I have a view of where I want it to go. And give it a dry before you do any edging or shading around it. It's really important to dry between your layers. Some people use a heat tool like I do. Some people work on multiple pages in multiple different books. So one's drying and they work on another. That never really worked for me. So here I'm grabbing my General's charcoal pencil, the medium, and I'm just going to add some shading or line work, very sketchy with the Generals. The medium doesn't smudge as easily as the soft, which is why I'm using it. You get that charcoal, hand-drawn kind of look, but it doesn't smudge easily. It will smudge, but not as much as the other one. And I like this look better than if I was using a micron pen, but that's personal preference. Some people go and outline with the micron pen and it looks great, kind of sketchily. So much of it is about personal preference. You know, it isn't about right or wrong. It's about preference in the moment. The other art journal page that I did using this same napkin, I used different techniques and I got a very different effect. So even though you're using the same focal image, you can get very different pages and projects. And that's one of the joys of using napkins, because you get multiple images. You can try it different ways and explore and experiment and figure out what works best for you or what you like best using one napkin. You can do 4 different pages, 4 different backgrounds, 4 different stenciling. What a great learning opportunity that is. Now I'm just shading around the sentiment. I want to make that vintage, and it kind of gets smudged a little bit on the sentiment, and I did that on purpose because I don't want it to look pristine white. Remember, this is a vintage page. So just adding a few more lines, looking at it. So now I love this page. Love the shimmer from the gold splatter. So we started with vintage printables on the page, and that really set the tone and the direction for this page. I did some stamping. I stenciled with thick gesso, actually the brick stencil, sorry. And I used a napkin for the focal image. I wanted this to look like it was a garden in front of a brick wall. I applied a wash of color to the whole page. It was very little color with a makeup sponge. It wasn't quite a wash. And then I used some of the colors from the flowers as well. I applied paint to the textured area of the brick to bring out that texture look. And I'm really happy with how that showed up. I did some stamping with the script stamp, and I did some stenciling with that leaf stencil. I adjusted the color of the focal image with a wash of watered down acrylic. I shaded or highlighted with the charcoal pencil. I added the sentiment. And I edged the page. And a good old splatter with gold. Thank you so much for joining me. There are a couple close-ups. And just a reminder, there is another video where I use this same napkin and get a totally different effect. Until next time, happy creating.